All right, this is Openstax US History, Chapter 9, Section 4, the new social order class divisions. So, especially in the North, one thing that the Industrial Revolution led to was a division of classes. Classes had always existed, but this time based off of wealth. And it became ever more clear, especially in urban centers where the industrial capitalists, the middle class, and even the working class ultimately lived all together. And that's kind of the three classes that really are most obvious, I would say, in the North. So beginning first with the economic elite, with the Industrial Revolution led to the rise of an industrial capitalist elite. If we're trying to, figure out who this is, these are essentially the people who own the factories. So they are the factory owners, and they make a lot of money based off of the new production techniques. Now, the industrials capital elite come from kind of two different origins. On the one hand, a lot of them have inherited their money from previous economic ventures. These might be people who, for example, were in sort of previous economic ventures. So this might be like overseas trade. Remember the economy really before the Industrial Revolution might have been about things like, spices, could have been tea, sugar, could have been even in the slave trade, investing in that. And it was taking all these other kind of older economic, staples and then transporting that or really investing in new factories. So these were people who had money and could put them into factories, can put them into, banking was a big one. Insurance companies were big, trains, railroad companies, et cetera, et cetera. An example of this is J.P. Morgan, who becomes really in the late 1800s. We'll just say probably one of the most important bankers in the United States, one of the most important wealthy bankers. He was an example of someone who inherited his wealth from someone, his father, right, who's pictured right here, rather than making his money from kind of the ground up. So we might just say of J.P. Morgan, he is one of the most wealthy post-Civil War bankers in the US, really probably in the world. And so there were a lot of the industrial elite that kind of came from that background. They had wealth in other areas. They saw new factories as an opportunity, threw their money, threw their investments in there, and became part of the factory owning class. Now, the industrial capital elite were pretty protective of their economic status. They created marriages between elites to make sure that families didn't sort of intermingle with some of the other classes. Other institutions that were created to separate the industrial elite included chambers of commerce. We might call this an institution to, we'll say to protect business. And of course, owners and investors. It was also sort of a social kind of thing as well, a way for businesses to organize. And social clubs, right? We might say elite and exclusionary. Now, meanwhile, we would call, some of those people old money. They come from inheritance. The Industrial Revolution also led to an industrial elite that came from a manufacturing class. This is a class that went from nothing into something, upward mobility. So we might say, there was also a manufacturing class that came from, we'll just say came from nothing into wealth. And one example that your textbook names is Peter Cooper, who started a glue business, an iron business, ultimately invented or invested in some railroads early on. And, he was really part of that class of, a few people in the United States that went from nothing into something, the American dream, so to speak. Those people who didn't come from anything, we'd call these people new money because they made their money recently, didn't always fit in with the culture of old money. But nonetheless, at the very top of Northern society was the industrial capitalist elite. Again, they were the ones who owned the factories or invested in them, typically did zero work whatsoever. The next class, and this really gives rise as a result of the industrial system, and that is the middle class. So they're not the owners, but they're typically in occupations that require education. But no labor, right? At least no, let me actually clarify that. No physical labor. We might call these, even though this wasn't the case at the time, we might call this white collar work because of the type of shirts. And at this time, the middle class could include things like factory managers. They could be salespeople on the retail front. They could be people involved in the banking industry or the insurance industry. In other words, their job doesn't require any physical labor, and in most cases, not all requires some sort of education. The middle class had a better material well-being than the working class. They weren't quite the owners of the factory system. Values such as hard work and education were especially important to the middle class, especially in terms of children. And the middle class believed very heavily that one of the factors to success was free and moral agency. That might be we'll call it the power to make the right decisions that lead to economic success. One good example of this is temperance. And temperance is we'll call it abstain from alcohol. So something that the middle class believed was that if one can properly abstain from alcohol, to make that free choice, to have the moral agency to do that, that would increase one's chances of succeeding, economically speaking. Also hard work. The harder one worked, the better chance that you had at succeeding. The middle class differed from the working class. The working class is the class of people that really don't have too much to own. They are wage workers, and they're involved in physical labor. This is, in most cases, in a post-industrial society, we're talking about the factory worker, right? The factory worker doesn't really require any education. It's very boring and repetitive tasks. They're very dangerous tasks, and they're typically the lowest wages, like we mentioned here, wage workers. It should be noted that the Panic of 1819 really hit workers, and in some cases, we'll also say farmers, even though we're typically not talking about the rural part of the country, but it hit workers the hardest in some sense. They were the first to lose their jobs. Some growing resentment going on there as a result of the Panic of 1819. The working class also differs a little bit in terms of the way that gender works and the way that families work. So whereas much more common in the middle class for women and children to not be engaged in any type of work, men, women, and children all worked for wages, right? All worked for wages. So a difference between the capitalist or industrial elite, the middle class, and the working class when it came to something like a children's education would be that the industrial elite would have access to all the best colleges in the country, really despite the the talent or intelligence of a child. A lot of children went to school just simply because they had the money to do so. In the middle class, they sent their children to school and education, but typically it was only the gifted ones that gained access. And the working class, you could have a very gifted child who was very, very intelligent, but they would have no access to education because they were really required to be working in order for the family to survive. Working class culture differed in that alcohol consumption was much higher. So, for example, one example of how the middle and the working class differ from each other is especially on some of these moral issues. So, when it comes to drinking much more culturally acceptable. But one thing that the middle and working class had in common was opposition to immigration, especially at this time, many German and Irish immigrants who are arriving to the United States.